Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hub International's webinar, Managing Workplace Violence Risk. My name is Paul Hasher, and I'm a Senior Risk Consultant with Hub's Risk Services Division, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. In this webinar, we'll walk you through the critical steps your organization can take to prevent workplace violence, from understanding the threat landscape to building a proper prevention program to securing the right insurance to protect your financial status of your company from the workplace violence. Regardless of your industry, this webinar is designed to give you a solid framework so you can implement starting today. But before we get started, we do have a quick housekeeping note. This information, please note this information we're sharing today is educational in nature and based on the information that's generally available. Nothing we discuss should be considered legal or tax advice. We encourage you to consult with your attorney and professional advisors about your organization's specific circumstances, regulations, and requirements. Today's session is being recorded. We'll send you the link afterwards so you can revisit the conversation and share it with your team. Now let's meet today's presenters. I have the pleasure of introducing you to John Schumacher and Madison Katz. First, we'll start off with John today. He's a senior risk consultant within Hub's organization resilience practice. He brings over 17 years of experience in enterprise security risk management and organization resilience. Previously, he served as a senior manager in security division for a Fortune 50 company. He led risk assessment initiatives and developed standardized security protocols for one of North America's largest retail organizations. At Hub, John specializes in emergency preparedness, workplace violence prevention, and critical incident response strategies to help our clients strengthen their operational continuity. Next, we'll hear from Madison. Madison's the Senior Vice President within our professional and executive risk here at Hub International. She specializes in management liability solutions for private and nonprofit clients throughout or across multiple coverages, including directors and officers, employment practices, and security and fiduciary liability. She brings extensive experience in advising our clients and maintaining market relationships on a national level. As we move into our discussion, we'll want to frame up three core themes: prevention, the proactive steps you can take before an incident; intervention, how you respond when a concern is identified; and thirdly, response, your action plan during and immediately after event. These three pillars will form the backbone of an effective workplace violence program for your organization. We'll walk through some trends and incidents. We'll define different types of workplace violence. And most importantly, we'll show you concrete steps you can take to protect your employees, safeguard your operations, and limit that financial impact of workplace violence on your organization. So now let me turn it over to John.
Thanks, Paul. So very quickly, I wanted just to preview today's agenda. We'll be going through some information in the next hour or so to discuss the history of this threat of workplace violence, some of the industry trends and definitions, and how you as an organization can plan for workplace violence and how to get started. Next slide, please. So active assailant incidents remain a persistent and evolving threat, even as media coverage may make it seem either isolated or sporadic. Beneath this random headline often lies a consistent pattern of targeted violence, as you can see, often driven by hate, ideology, or personal grievance. You might actually remember some of these events. This is a 10-year timeline, and it just is a highlight or showing the trends of why workplace violence, and more importantly, an intervention program, is so critical to your business and business continuity. Next slide, please. So next, I just want to walk you through a few headlines that kind of highlights this risk to your organization. The first is the United Healthcare CEO shooting. So here's the situation. On December 4th of 2024, the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson, was assassinated outside of his Midtown Manhattan hotel. At 6:45 a.m., Thompson was actually walking to the New York Hilton in Midtown for United Healthcare's investor meeting. He was shot in a targeted and premeditated event. A 9mm pistol was used with a suppressor, allegedly a ghost gun that had a silencer and parts that were printed. So not only was this really an unfortunate incident for Brian, but largely for United Healthcare as well. The stock fell the days after the CEO's death, with nearly a 9 to 10% drop that week, including a 3% single day decline. Moreover, the murder ignited heated public debate in the US and beyond around the US healthcare system and insurance companies' practices, particularly regarding denial of claims, and a significant wave of online scrutiny and negative publicity followed. Next, I want to talk just a little bit about a nonprofit example. This is a stabbing at a homeless shelter. The attack occurred on June 2nd, 2025, about 7:15 p.m. A dozen people were injured in a stabbing attack at an Oregon homeless shelter on a Sunday night. A man with an 8-inch knife walked into the lobby of the Union Gospel Mission, and he pulled the knife and stabbed several people. According to the police, there was 2 staff members that were also actually injured, and a 12th victim was also identified after the fact. So here's the background. The man arrived in the mission on the previous night and was about to check into the 150-person ministry. The second night, he was supposed to hand over his belongings to the staff. And as he began to start to hand over his belongings, he began to stab people. And so one of the things I just wanted to kind of talk about here is there are many key risk factors, such as open environments, vulnerable clients, overnight stay, check-in processes, and it shows that extreme violence or mass casualty events can happen in the nonprofit sector. And it just shows the importance of a physical access control and strong training. Next slide, please. In addition, workplace violence can take many different forms. The first example I would call out is a vehicle ramming at an LA nightclub. In this instance, 37 people were injured, including 7 critically. Here's the backstory. Early morning on July 19th of 2025 in East Hollywood, Los Angeles, a man drove a Nissan Versa onto a sidewalk and into a crowd of people. 30 were injured, 7 critically. The motive was tied to the fact that this man had been ejected from the nightclub earlier that evening and denied reentry. And so I just wanted to kind of pause and highlight this. How many of you have an organization or a workplace that's open to the public? Similar to other commercial space attacks, this kind of attack actually did drive a lot of renewed scrutiny related to security measures in high traffic nightlife areas, such as line control, sidewalk protection, barriers, crowd management, all to prevent vehicles from being operated in pedestrian zones. It also raises concerns about businesses reassessing emergency preparedness, staff training, and physical security in public-facing businesses. And the last headline I wanted to leave you with is a man disguised as a gardener attacked a pro-Israel demonstration at Pearl Street Mall, and this was in Colorado, with Molotov cocktails and a makeshift flamethrower. The use of a Molotov cocktail and a makeshift flamethrower represents a rare but deeply destructive method compared to firearms. The attacker vocalized slogans like "Free Palestine" and "End Zionist Rule," making this an anti-Semitic hate attack. So now I'm going to pass it over to Madison, and she's going to talk a little bit more about workplace violence and some of the background details.
Thank you, John. If we move on to the next section, I'll be taking us through where we'll explore workplace violence trends, definitions, and the legal landscape surrounding this critical issue. On the next slide, we will start off by level setting with some important context. When we look at overall US violent crime rates since 1990, we see something that might surprise you. They've actually been on a downward trend. This graph clearly shows that, statistically speaking, we are experiencing less violent crime today than we did 3 decades ago. Now, I know that might seem counterintuitive, especially given what we see in the news every day. Many people perceive our current time frame as being the most crime-ridden in history, but the data tells a different story. However, and this is crucial, while overall crime rates are declining, there's a significant exception to this trend, which we'll see on the next slide. Here's where things get concerning. While overall crime rates have declined, Gun violence and active shooter incidents have been steadily increasing over the past decade. On the left, you can see gun deaths reaching near record highs. On the right, both FBI designated active shooter incidents and mass shootings as tracked by the Gun Violence Archive have reached levels in the past 5 years that far exceed the previous decades. This is a critical distinction. Most workplace violence don't involve a weapon and don't result in death. However, active assailant events are increasingly common and pose serious concerns to both the public and private sectors. These types of events can happen anywhere at any time to anyone, and that's what makes workplace violence such a pressing issue for organizations today. Let's put some numbers to this on the following slide. It's estimated that 25% of workplace violence incidents go unreported. Even with that underreporting, we still see over 2 million reported incidents each year. Now, looking back at the past 5 to 6 years, we have some skewed data. Millions of people began working from home during the pandemic, which reduced exposure for some. But on the flip side, those who continued working with the public, healthcare workers, retail employees, educators, faced an increased risk of violence. And even with this skewed data, each year there are an estimated 400 to 800 intentional fatal incidents and over 55,000 intentional non-fatal injuries. In total, this costs employers $250 billion annually. And unfortunately, there's no reason to believe this trend will improve anytime soon. Here's an important point, and on the next slide, I really want to emphasize workplace violence is not just about guns or active shooters. In fact, 73% of reported workplace violence incidents involve no weapon at all. Active shooter events may be the most publicized, and understandably so, but every single day, thousands of non-physical acts of violence occur in workplaces across the country. Threats, harassment, intimidation, these are all forms of workplace violence, and they're far more common than most people realize. So how do we define workplace violence? The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, defines it as not only an act of physical violence, but also the threat of violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening disruptive behavior that occurs at the work site. It can affect and involve employees, clients, customers, and visitors. So before we move on, I want to make a quick note about terminology. In terms of insurance coverage, which we will talk about later in the presentation, you'll see carriers use different names for this: workplace violence, active shooter, deadly weapons, but they're all used pretty much synonymously. So as we go forward, I may refer to it by different names, but we're talking about the same coverage and issue. On the next slide, we'll get into the categories from OSHA defining workplace violence into distinct types based on the relationship between the aggressor and the victim. So let me walk you through these. Type 1, criminal intent. This is where there's no legitimate relationship to the workplace. Violence occurs during the commission of another crime, think robbery or shoplifting. Type 2, customer or client. Here, the perpetrator is a customer, client, patient, inmate, passenger. The violence occurs in the context of services that are being provided. This is a very common occurrence in healthcare and social services. Type 3, worker on worker. A current or former employee attacks or threatens a coworker, supervisor, or subordinate. And type 4, personal relationship. This is where the perpetrator has a personal relationship with an employee. Domestic violence that spills into the workplace is a classic example of this. Now, at Hub, we also recognize a fifth type, which is ideological or extremist violence. This is motivated by extremist beliefs, political, religious, or ideological. The perpetrator may or may not have a direct connection to the workplace. An example would be where an extremist attacking a workplace is to send a message or punish the organization. Overall, understanding these types of workplace violence helps organizations develop targeted prevention strategies. So why are employers held responsible in the aftermath of a violent attack? It comes down to duty of care. The OSHA Act of 1970 established what's known as the General Duty Clause, which requires employers to provide a workplace that is free from recognized hazards that could cause death or serious physical harm. This sets a high standard of safety that employers must meet. Now, here's the interesting part. While this duty of care is clearly outlined, there is technically no specific federal health and safety standard that requires employers to have workplace violence prevention plans or policies in place. There was a bill introduced to the House in 2025, HR 2531, which would address workplace violence in healthcare, social services, as well as other sectors. It would require the Department of Labor to issue standards mandating that certain employers take actions to protect their workers. This bill was originally introduced in 2018, passed by the House in 2019, passed again by the House in 2021, reintroduced again in 2023, and now, as of today, the last movement on this bill was a motion to review it in subcommittee. It hasn't progressed further. So in the absence of federal standards, many states have enacted their own laws. Depending on the state, these regulations may require written policies and prevention programs, employee training, safety committees, record keeping and reporting of incidents, and procedures for seeking injunctive relief. The states listed here, from Arizona to Washington, have varying levels of regulation, ranging from minimal to comprehensive. It's important for organizations to understand the specific requirements in the states where they operate. Not surprisingly, certain industries face higher risk of workplace violence than others. At the top of the list are healthcare and social assistance, educational services, real estate and rental, food services and retail, and entertainment and recreation. What do all of these have in common? They all involve significant interaction with the public, whether it's a nurse dealing with a distressed patient, a teacher managing a classroom, a retail worker handling customer complaints, or a bartender dealing with intoxicated patrons. These are all high exposure situations. Now let's take a closer look on the next slide of those non-physical forms of violence that I had mentioned earlier. These can include slander, manipulation, humiliation, abuse or misuse of power, degrading or offensive language and behavior, screaming or cursing in private or public, intimidation, whether physical or otherwise, bullying, and isolation. These forms of non-physical violence are far more common than an active shooter event with 10 or 20 casualties. Think about the industries we just discussed. How often do we see videos of bullying, screaming, cursing, humiliation in retail settings? How often do healthcare workers face verbal abuse from patients or their family members? These repeated and persistent intrusions that cause alarm, harassment, or distress will trigger a workplace violence policy. And that's important because these incidents, while not physically violent, can escalate, and they create a hostile, unsafe work environment. And as an important side note, while the majority of incidents are non-physical, workplace injuries and homicides, as we saw earlier, are still a pressing issue that can happen to anyone in any work environment, and we can't lose sight of that. Now that we've established the landscape, what workplace violence looks like, who's at risk, and what the legal framework is, I'm going to pass it over to John again, who will walk us through the planning and preparedness strategies organizations can implement to address this risk.
Thank you, Madison. So now I want to spend a few minutes talking about how an organization can plan for workplace violence by taking steps to implement a workplace violence program, policies, and response protocol. Let's get into it on how we can deal with this issue. So developing a workplace violence program and threat assessment and intervention process sounds scary and hard. The sentiment I often hear is that people and organizations really can't do anything about this, and there's a sense of helplessness, but it's simply not true or accurate. It isn't really all that different from things that we're more familiar with, like workplace hazard programs. And the approach is essentially the same. So let's walk through an example. Let's pretend there's ice on a sidewalk outside of your building. The problem has been identified of it being icy, and we know that we must do something because we have context to this situation and experience and tools that we know how to use. So our experience and plan says when it's icy, someone could fall down and hurt themselves, and we must do something. Or we see in the forecast that it's going to snow and be icy, and we need to plan and prepare and react in a way that includes various preventative measures. So for example, we put up signage or we start spreading salt. So I want to help shift the paradigm. Next slide, please. I want to shift our mindset to have a conversation and how we can go from being reactive to being more proactive and strategic so that we can effectively manage the risks of workplace violence with the end goal of preventing serious violent events. Next slide. So I wanted to talk about our philosophy and the industry's philosophy in terms of being left of loss. And this is just a linear representation of how workplace violence can often unfold. And it's meant to show that there are things that we can do to address workplace violence. So the left of loss philosophy really illustrates that early identification and mitigation of potential workplace violence incidents by being aware of warning signs, being strategic about how we intervene and mitigate, and understanding the escalation pathway towards an event is critically important to being proactive and prevention focused. So we can understand that before a violent event is happening. Employers should allocate time and resources towards prevention and intervention initiatives to stay left of loss, to help protect your people, profit, and property. And so here's the punchline. The more time that your company spends left of loss, the less time your company is going to spend recovering right of loss. Next slide, please. So when we think about left of loss, you shouldn't just do it because John's saying so, but actually, in fact, there are industry standards for workplace violence programs, the planning and process development that is grounded in industry best practices and certifications. One of those is the ASIS Workplace Violence and Active Assailant Prevention, Intervention, and Response standard. In this document, there's a robust amount of information that outlines a multitude of topics related to workplace violence, such as defining the reach of a workplace violence program, how to implement policies, programs, and training, how threats should be responded to and managed, how to interact with law enforcement, how an organization should consider intimate partner violence, and how to plan for an active assailant situation. Next slide. So now I just want to think about preparedness and planning through the lens of both the employer and the employee. So as you start to think about your organization, thinking about it through these two lenses can often help you think about roles and responsibilities for each party. So generally speaking, as an employer, you need to develop and drive awareness for workplace violence through things like a policy, a program, a training protocol, reporting processes, security, and emergency action plan. So just think about what this might mean for your organization. Do you have all of these things? Do you have a reporting hotline that employees can call into anonymously? If they see something, they know how to say something. As an employee, they need to follow and communicate. So they need to adhere to company policy. They need to know how to report threats and concerns. They need to be respectful and professional, and they need to be familiar with their facility so that they can have individual readiness should something bad happen at their location. And so what this is really meant to show is that an effective workplace violence program has roles and responsibility for both the employer and the employee. So now that we've talked a little bit more about the baseline plan and how to prepare by being strategic and proactive, let's talk more about a pragmatic approach on how you can get started to implement this program. So Hub tries to simplify developing a workplace violence program by showing a linear step-by-step process. Often, as I have met with Hub clients, I often see a gap in support or alignment at a leadership level. It's often an HR director or a risk manager being tasked to own managing workplace violence without any resources or time dedicated to it. And often there's a lack of leadership alignment. So instead, a client often comes to me and says, hey, with this headline going on, our senior leaders are really worried about active shooter and we need some active shooter training. Clients don't understand that often there's an order of operations in which things need to be done to truly develop a workplace violence program. This baseline and the following process that I'm about to talk about will help you minimize this whack-a-mole approach or being reactive. So bottom line, we recommend moving through this or a similar approach in a step-by-step process that starts with leadership awareness and engagement, conducting a risk assessment, moving into program development based on those two previous steps, and then implementing your program and having a threat response. The threat response and management capability is critically important, and we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper now. Next slide, please. As we start to talk about getting started, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about this threat assessment process. This is really the actionable part of the prevention program, and this is where action is actually being done to prevent violence. The threat management capability is often where this comes to life. It's often completed by a small, dedicated team called a threat management team or a threat assessment team. And this can be done either internally by a small team or by outside experts. For smaller organizations, this might mean that there are 1 or 2 people that are employed by the organization, someone typically in HR or a security-minded individual. And so the important part is that there needs to be a consistency in the people who are making decisions and the way that this is done. Leveraging tool and resources is really important in terms of decision making, and we'll go into that a little bit more. Next, I just wanted to talk about there needs to be a way to hear about this threat. Can you go back to the previous slide, please? Yeah, so next there needs to be a way about hearing about this threat. What are those mechanisms? And then the last thing that I would talk about today is a consistent use of protocols to manage and assess the threat and violent situation. So we want to take the human judgment out of this situation as much as possible. So for example, if someone says, I'm so mad at you, Susie, I could kill you, and that was taken out of context, one person who's assessing that threat could say, oh, it's not that big of a deal. And another person could say, wow, that's really serious. And so that's where we want to have a structured and inconsistent way to review that. And so leveraging those, like, again, pre-identified resources for specific situations are really important, and being consistent with decision making. So things like a safe and secure plan are important to keep people safe, using structured judgment tools, and having protocols and reports to document a threat. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on structured judgment tools next. Next slide, please. So often people don't know as much about structured judgment tools, and it's really a tool that provides a consistent way to judge a threat. It drives the human decision-making out of the process, and it really does this by featuring prompting questions with needed information, and it guides you through the threat and helps you assess it consistently. Next slide. And this is done by using a basic assessment questionnaire. It helps you assess the facts, the severity of the situation, and it aids in that consistent assessment on how to respond, what to do, when to respond, in what time frame, and also who needs to be involved by asking these basic prompting questions as a starting place. Next slide, please. And the last thing that I really wanted to do is just leave you with an example. And this is really intended just to show how simple a workplace violence program and threat response and management process can actually be, and how it comes to life oftentimes in a small organization. So this story really, it involves a teen named Alexis. She had dropped out of high school and was working as a server at a local pizza joint. One of her coworkers saw Alexis showing a video of her shooting guns. She said she just bought a new AK-47 and threatened to shoot up 400 people for fun, and that there were so many people at her old school that she would like to kill. So this coworker, overhearing this conversation and seeing the video, told their manager. The manager engaged law enforcement, and law enforcement applied the structured judgment tool that we kind of talked about earlier and the threat assessment process. And here's what they learned. They learned that she tried to re-enroll in this school, but could not due to previous behavioral incidents. She had disturbing photos on her phone. She had been bullied, and in the past, she was suicidal. She now had the means and was making a very specific threat. So the police quickly informed the high school of this threat, temporarily locked it down, and on her way home from her shift, officers took Alexis into custody, and nothing bad happened to anybody. And so what this is meant to show is that programs do not have to be a significant, big investment and by only big companies. It actually can be very simple solutions for smaller organizations, but it really need to have one common theme. If you see something, you need to know how to say something. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Madison.
Thank you, John. We can shift to the next slide. I'd like to shift our focus to the insurance perspective and how coverage can help organizations manage the financial and operational fallout from an actual workplace violence incident. Let's start with a case some of you might be familiar with, the 2015 San Bernardino attack, where an employee and his wife showed up at a work holiday party and tragically killed 14 people and wounded another 22. In the aftermath, the employer became responsible for the care of both the victims and the survivors. Survivors who chose to take temporary leave continued to receive their full salary. Victims and their families were provided benefits for medical and psychiatric care, though there were complaints from victims expressing dissatisfaction with the scope of those benefits. And on top of victim-related expenses, the employer also suffered significant loss of business. All told, this attack cost them $4 million. A workplace violence policy would have provided coverage for many of those expenses, including preventative services, business interruption losses, third-party legal liability, and victim expenses. This is exactly the kind of scenario these policies are designed to address. So what does a workplace violence policy actually cover? First, it's important to understand that workplace violence coverage is a premises-based policy. That means it insures based on location. It doesn't follow a person or company from place to place. However, some carriers do offer an off-site endorsement, which provides coverage for employees who work in multiple locations rather than one centralized premises. Some policies also offer a coverage radius, which means the policy can be triggered if an act of violence occurs within a predetermined radius of the insured premises. Now, let's talk about the 4 primary coverage areas. The first being legal liability. This is a critical component if a third party is seeking retribution in the aftermath of an event. It covers defense costs and damages. Victim expenses. This includes psychiatric care, counseling, funeral expenses, and other costs directly related to the victims. Business expenses. This covers business income loss and loss of attraction, essentially the revenue you lose because operations are disrupted or customers stay away. And finally, prevention costs, which many carriers will allocate a portion of the premium to preventative services, which we'll talk about on the next slide. There are 3 major benefits to purchasing workplace violence coverage, the first being prevention services. This is the preventative training John just discussed, but in addition to our own internal resources, many carriers also, as I mentioned, allocate part of that premium to outside services that provide similar training, such as threat assessments, de-escalation techniques, active shooter response drills, and more. Second is crisis management services. When an incident occurs, carriers provide resources for investigating the incident and managing the response. Clients receive advice and support from qualified professionals who are trained to deal with these types of events, both during the event and in the aftermath of the event. This is also a critical component in preventing non-physical forms of violence from escalating into something more serious. And the third benefit is insurance indemnification. This is where the legal liability, victim expenses, and business interruption coverage comes into play. When the worst happens, this coverage helps organizations manage the financial impact and focus on recovery. Now, not all workplace violence policies are created equal. On the next slide, I will show certain exclusions you want to avoid when reviewing coverage options. We have terrorism exclusions. Some policies do exclude acts deemed to be terrorism. This can create a significant coverage gap in the policy. Vehicle exclusion. If an assailant uses a vehicle as a weapon, some policies won't cover it. Drone exclusion is an emerging threat, and some policies are starting to exclude drone-related attacks. Requirement for explosives to be physically attached to an assailant. This is a very specific exclusion that can limit coverage for bomb threats or explosive devices. Mental anguish exclusion. Some policies exclude non-physical injuries like emotional distress. This is a huge gap given what we know about the non-physical forms of violence mentioned previously. Casualties threshold. Some policies only are triggered if a certain number of people are injured or killed. This is problematic for smaller scale incidents. And finally, we have employee exclusions. Some policies exclude coverage if the perpetrator is an employee. Given that type 3 violence, worker on worker, is incredibly common, this exclusion can be very limiting. You want to work with a knowledgeable broker to make sure your policy doesn't have these gaps. A question we often hear is, can't we just rely on our existing insurance policies? And on the next slide, I will explain why the short answer is no. General liability has a legal liability trigger, meaning it only responds after an event has occurred and someone is suing you. It provides no coverage for threat assessment, crisis management, or risk reduction services. Many GL policies are also beginning to exclude violent acts altogether. Terrorism insurance requires the act to be politically, religiously, or ideologically motivated. It also requires a physical damage trigger, both of which would exclude many workplace violence incidents from coverage. And again, similar to the GL, there's no services for risk reduction here. And then we have workers' compensation, which requires that an employee be injured. It excludes intentional acts and acts committed by non-employees. So if a customer attacks an employee, or if an employee is traumatized but not physically injured, there's no coverage. It also excludes third parties, visitors, customers, contractors. All three of these policies have significant coverage gaps that are only addressed by a dedicated workplace violence policy. That's why standalone coverage is so important. So how do you get a quote? On the next slide, it'll list the requirements for a full quote. We will need number of employees, number of annual guests, visitors or patrons, number of locations, hours of operation, years in business, employee protocols and hiring practices, as well as loss experience. Some carriers also require a schedule of values for the properties that need to be covered. Since property damage is sometimes included as a bonus coverage in these policies, though it's not the primary intention. If you provide all this information, a quote can typically be turned around in 2 weeks or less. But for a quick indication, you can provide just basic information such as name of the insured, type of business, number of locations, number of employees, and number of annual guests. And I can get you a ballpark figure much faster. Now, beyond the basic submission information, there are additional factors that influence pricing. These are risk factors that increase exposure to workplace violence. exchanging money with the public, working with volatile or unstable people, working alone or in isolated areas, providing services and care to the public, working where alcohol is served, working late at night or in areas with high crime rates, working in large gatherings of the general public, and offering abortion services. All of these factors will be considered when underwriters price your policy. Finally, on the next slide, let's talk about the current marketplace. Here's a comparison of 6 carriers that offer workplace violence coverage: XXL, Beasley, Hiscox, TMHCC, Star, and Samfire. As you can see, limits range anywhere from $5 million to $30 million. Minimum retentions range anywhere from $0 to $10,000. Minimum premiums range anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000. In most cases, it really varies based off the location of the insured and how many locations they are looking to have insured. All of these carriers provide legal liability coverage as well as victim expense coverage. Most also provide business interruption coverage under their policy. One important differentiator is the coverage radius I had mentioned earlier. Hiscox and Samfire offer limited coverage within 1 mile and 5 miles, respectively. The other carriers require an endorsement for offsite coverage that is usually associated with additional premium. It's also worth noting that limited coverage is available under some carriers' employment practices liability policies. So if you currently purchase that coverage, I encourage you to reach out to your broker to see what coverage may already be available under your current policies, though in most cases, a standalone policy will provide much broader protection. That concludes the insurance and coverage portion of our presentation. I'll now turn it back over to Paul.
Great. Thanks, Madison and John, for all that key information for our clients and our viewers today. So what comes next? We want to leave you with 3 concrete actions your organization can take immediately. First, conduct an internal risk assessment. Identify where you have exposures, what gaps exist in your current approach. You don't need a consultant to start. Just take an honest look at your facility, your workforce, your interactions with the public, and your current policies that you have in place within your organization. Secondly, assess the maturity of your workplace violence prevention program. Do you have one? And if you do, is it documented? Is it communicated? And is it practiced on a regular basis? If you don't have a program, now's the time to build one. We've shown you the roadmap today to help you get started. Then lastly and thirdly, partner with your broker like Hub, who has the expertise and carriers to support your needs. Don't try to do this on your own. The right partners can make that implementation faster and much more effective. So these 3 steps will set your organization on a path to stronger safety culture and a measurable risk reduction when it comes to workplace violence. So that concludes our webinar as we move into our final slide today. Thank you. Time and attention today. Workplace violence is a serious threat. It's also one proactive, systematic action to make a difference, as we talked about today. We've covered a lot of ground, everything from understanding the threat to building a program to securing that right coverage for your organization. If you have questions or you want to discuss your organization's situation, please visit hubinternational.com or reach out to your Hub broker. We're here to help. Thank you and have a safe, secure day.